My name is Emma Carson. I'm 30 years old, a full colonel in the U.S. Army Cyber Command, and tonight I'm standing in front of the same faded blue door I walked out of 5 years ago without saying goodbye. I parked my rented SUV on the same cracked driveway I learned to ride a bike on, right next to my mother's aging minivan. The porch light flickered weakly overhead, casting a warm but dim glow across the chipped steps and the familiar welcome mat with fraying edges. Nothing had changed. Not the boxwood hedges that still needed trimming, not the screen door with a tear at the corner, not the overwhelming feeling I always had when I came back here, that blend of being invisible and overly scrutinized all at once. I stood there for a long moment, keys in hand, my palms dry despite the storm churning in my stomach. They used to call this military calm, the stillness before action. But this wasn't deployment. This wasn't a hostile border crossing. This was dinner with my family, and somehow that felt heavier. I rang the doorbell out of habit. "It's open," my mother called from somewhere in the kitchen. She didn't come to the door. Of course she didn't. I pushed it open and stepped inside. Same floral scent, same beige carpet, same wall of family photos lining the hallway. My brother Nathan's graduation, his wedding, his 2 kids dressed as pirates for Halloween. Not a single picture of me in uniform, not even the framed commissioning portrait I mailed home the year I became an officer. I paused in the hallway for a second longer than I meant to. Then I walked through. "Dinner's almost ready," my mother said without turning around. "Nathan and Camille are on their way. He just got promoted again, can you believe it?" "That's great, Mom," I said politely. "You'll want to congratulate him. He's leading the whole systems integration division now. Everyone at your father's company says he's going places." Of course, I replied, my smile tight and practiced. That phrase, "going places," used to haunt me. It always sounded like a train I had missed. The dining table was already set for 6. No place cards, but the seating arrangement was unspoken and unchanged since childhood. Dad at the head, Nathan to his right, Mom beside him, Camille at the other end, and me somewhere. Probably at the far corner. The space filler. The last time I sat at this table, I was a disappointment. I had chosen the military over business school, had declined my father's offer to join Westbridge Technologies, had walked away from the path. And they never let me forget it. Not through words exactly, but in what they didn't say, what they didn't ask. I made my way upstairs to my old room. Same twin bed, same quilt my grandmother made when I turned 12. Same posters on the wall, college acceptance letters, honor roll certificates, junior ROTC ribbons. The only life of mine they seemed willing to display was the one that stopped existing the moment I joined the Army. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared out the window. The neighborhood looked smaller now. Or maybe I just grew. Either way, I wasn't the same Emma who once cried into this pillow after being told she was meant for more. My father said that the day I turned down business school for the ROTC scholarship, he meant his version of more, of course, an MBA, a corner office, a lifetime of following in his footsteps. But tomorrow morning, I wouldn't be the one following. At 0900 sharp, I'd be walking into Westbridge Technologies as the Pentagon liaison for Project Sentinel. I'd be wearing the uniform no one here ever acknowledged. And I'd be sitting across the table from the very people who once said I was throwing my life away. Let them have tonight. Tomorrow, everything changes. Nathan and Camille arrived exactly on time, like always. My brother's knock was more of a formality than a request. He opened the door without waiting and walked in like he owned the place, which in a way he always had. "Hey, Em," he said, as he gave me a quick one-armed hug, already looking past me toward Dad. "Long time." 5 years, I replied, meeting his eyes. He blinked, unsure if I was joking. I wasn't. Camille followed behind him with a bottle of wine in hand, something imported, something none of us would actually enjoy, but everyone would pretend to appreciate. She gave me a brief smile, then turned her full attention to my mother, exchanging compliments like well-rehearsed dialogue in a play. We sat down for dinner, roast beef, mashed potatoes, and the exact same side salad my mom had been making since I was 10. The dishes never changed, neither did the conversation. Nathan held court effortlessly. He talked about performance bonuses and quarterly earnings, about his team's new AI-assisted logistics platform, and how Westbridge had just signed a major contract with the Department of Defense. Dad hung on to every word, like it was gospel. I sat in silence, my fork tracing circles in mashed potatoes I barely touched. And you, Mom turned to me with that same polite, empty smile she always used when she didn't know how to feel. Still traveling around with the Army. More or less, I said. Still a captain, Dad asked, eyes on his plate. Something like that. Must be tough, Nathan added, slicing his roast beef. Being in the field all the time. No long-term strategy, just following orders. I took a sip of water and said nothing. They didn't know. None of them did. Not about my last promotion, not about my current assignment, not about the fact that I held final approval authority on a project that Nathan had just spent 10 minutes bragging about. It would have been easy to say something right then, to drop a title, a fact, a pointed truth, but I didn't. I let them talk. I let them speak over me like they always had, because tomorrow wasn't about vindication. It was about clarity. After dinner, Dad retreated to his leather recliner in the living room, scrolling through market reports on his tablet like the world couldn't spin without his input. Mom and Camille cleared the table while chatting about Nathan's upcoming speaking engagement at a Defense Innovation Summit. I stayed seated, watching them move around me as if I were a shadow, not unwelcome, but unnecessary. Nathan came back into the dining room with a glass of scotch. He leaned against the archway, swirling the amber liquid like he was auditioning for a commercial. "You still single?" he asked casually. "Yup," he nodded, satisfied. "Makes sense. Always moving around. Hard to build anything that way." I smiled without warmth. "Not for everyone." He didn't respond. He just took a sip and walked off, leaving the smell of expensive whiskey and effortless arrogance in his wake. Eventually, I went back upstairs. I opened my suitcase and checked on the uniform folded inside. Midnight blue pressed to perfection. Ribbons and medals aligned in perfect order. The Silver Eagle insignia gleamed softly under the light. They had no idea who I had become, not because I kept it from them, but because they never asked. Because to them, I stopped being relevant the moment I chose something outside their blueprint. They never saw past their disappointment long enough to ask what I was building instead. But tomorrow morning, that ignorance ends. They won't need to ask. They'll see it in the way people stand when I enter the room, in the way the CEO addresses me, in the placard on the table that reads, "Colonel Emma Carson, Pentagon Liaison." I didn't come here to prove anything, but they're going to see me anyway. If there's one thing the military taught me, it's how to do the work and not expect applause. That mindset came in handy long before I ever wore a uniform. When Nathan bought his first condo, I co-signed the loan to help him secure a lower interest rate. My parents didn't know he told me not to say anything, said it would make him look dependent. I didn't mind at the time. I had just received my second deployment bonus and figured helping my brother was what family did. Later, when he upgraded to a 5-bedroom in the suburbs, he toasted to hard work and timing. My name wasn't even mentioned. When Mom needed emergency dental surgery 3 years ago, I wired the money the same day she called crying. She told me not to tell Dad. He would have considered it a waste. I never got a thank you text. Just a short message a week later, surgery went fine. I knew what that meant. It meant she'd rather pretend the money had come from somewhere else. I sent gifts for every holiday. Paid for a new refrigerator one winter when theirs broke down, and Dad was too stubborn to admit they couldn't afford a replacement before Christmas. I even helped fund Nathan's MBA tuition back when he got laid off and didn't want to touch his savings. He told people Camille's parents had helped. It wasn't about the money. It never was. It was about being seen. But no matter how many ways I tried to earn that recognition discreetly, respectfully, it always disappeared into the family void, never acknowledged, never remembered. I wasn't the daughter who gave. I was the daughter who left. The one who chose boots over boardrooms. In their minds, I'd walked away from opportunity and into something lesser. My father once told me flat out that the Army was for people without real options, that I was meant for more, his version of more, of course. He never asked why I chose to serve. Never wanted to hear that the structure, the mission, the challenge of leading people under pressure gave me something I never found in corporate internships or networking mixers. I wasn't lost, I wasn't flailing, I had just wanted a different kind of impact. But different in this family always translated to disappointment. I kept thinking it would shift, that one day they'd read an article I was featured in, that they'd see my name on a briefing memo, that some defense news segment would flash my image in uniform and it would finally click she did something. But if they ever saw, they never said. Last Thanksgiving, I was embedded with a cyber operations team overseas, supporting a joint NATO exercise. I called in time zones be damned just to wish everyone well. No one picked up. I left a message. Later that night, Nathan posted a group family photo. Everyone smiling, wine glasses raised. My mother's caption read, "Thankful for the ones who matter most." I stared at that sentence for too long. Then I closed the app, powered down my phone, and went back to work. I told myself it didn't bother me, that I'd grown out of needing their validation. But the truth was, every ignored effort still cut the same way, just quieter now. I stopped reaching out as often, stopped sending updates, stopped trying to explain why my life had meaning. And in return, the silence from their end deepened. What started as a one-sided conversation eventually became nothing at all. They assumed I drifted, that the distance was mine. But I wasn't drifting, I was retreating, one letdown at a time. They never saw the ways I showed up, but I did again and again from behind the scenes quietly, like a ghost who still felt obligated to care. The first time I wired money home was during my second year in the Army. Dad had been passed over for a major contract and things got tight. Mom didn't say much on the phone, but I could hear it in her voice, strained, careful, embarrassed. "We'll manage," she said. I didn't ask for details. I just sent $5,000 with no note. A week later, she texted, "Things are fine now. Hope you're staying warm." No mention of the money. It became a pattern. New furnace, medical bills, Nathan's tuition shortfall, Camille's car repairs. I was always the invisible contingency plan, never acknowledged, never celebrated, just expected. Even the time Nathan called me directly trying to sound casual, as he explained how tight things were after he and Camille decided to buy into a private school for the kids. He called it an investment in their future, but he needed help with the deposit. I wired the money that night. At Thanksgiving, he toasted Camille's parents for their generosity. I sat there with a smile so steady it ached in my face. And I kept doing it, because part of me believed, maybe hoped that love could be earned this way, that if I just kept giving, kept serving, someone in that house would finally look at me and see value. Not guilt, not rebellion, just me. But they didn't. Not when I sent Mom flowers on her birthday from Kabul, not when I paid off their credit card bill after Dad's emergency dental surgery, not even when I bought plane tickets so they could attend my officer promotion ceremony, and they never showed. I got a voicemail from Mom that morning. "Your father's not feeling well. We'll take you out to dinner next time you're in town." There was no next time. By then, I had learned to stop hoping. The military has a way of teaching you hierarchy, duty, protocol, but what it doesn't prepare you for is the emptiness of loving people who refuse to see your worth unless it's convenient. That's what my family became, a panel of judges who only saw me when I was failing to meet their expectations. The worst part, I let it happen. I kept reaching. I kept trying. After my first deployment, I sent them an article that quoted me as a lead analyst on a cyber defense task force. Dad never replied. When I brought it up later, he said, "I'm glad you're keeping busy." Keeping busy. They didn't understand my world, and they didn't want to. They thought the Army was a detour, a phase, something I'd snap out of once I came to my senses. And when I didn't, they simply stopped including me in the story. Holiday dinners happened without me. Nathan got promoted again, and no one told me until 6 months later. Family photos appeared online with captions like "all of us together." My name never came up. I once sent Mom a framed photo of me shaking hands with the Secretary of Defense at a cybersecurity summit. I thought maybe that would make her proud. She never hung it. When I asked about it during a rare phone call, she said, "Oh, I think it's still in the box somewhere. I didn't want to damage it." But I knew. It just didn't belong on the wall, not next to Nathan's awards, not next to their chosen son. I was the quiet benefactor, the unseen soldier, the fallback when things broke, but never the pride when they held together. And tomorrow, for the first time, I wouldn't be behind the curtain. I'd be sitting at the head of the table, and they'd have no choice but to look at me. It didn't happen all at once, the feeling of being erased. It was gradual, like dust gathering on something once precious. You don't notice the first layer or even the second, but one day the shine is gone and you can't remember the last time someone really looked at you. That's how it was with my family. After I joined the Army, the updates slowed. The texts got shorter, the phone calls more infrequent. At first I told myself it was just distance and time zones. Everyone was busy, everyone had their own lives. But that wasn't true. They made time for Nathan's promotions, for Camille's baby showers, for Dad's retirement party. I just wasn't invited to those conversations anymore. They stopped sending group messages. Family news reached me late, if at all. I learned about my cousin's engagement through Facebook 2 weeks after the celebration. The photo showed everyone smiling in front of a backyard banner that read, "She said yes, everyone but me." I hadn't even known she was dating someone. I scrolled through the pictures, wondering if they noticed my absence, or worse, if they didn't. What stung more than the exclusion was the silence. No one explained. No one said, "We thought you were busy," or, "It slipped our minds." The silence felt intentional, like I had become an awkward footnote in a family story they preferred not to complicate. There was a Christmas where I mailed personalized gifts to every person in the family, monogrammed journals, digital photo frames, books I'd handpicked based on things they once told me they loved. No one responded, not even a generic thank you. But in Mom's end-of-year family newsletter, she wrote so grateful for the people who make the holidays brighter, especially Nathan, Camille, and the boys. I wasn't even mentioned. Not once. Not as a daughter, a soldier, or a sister. It was like I had disappeared. And maybe I had. I stopped sending updates about my deployments. I stopped calling after big wins. When I earned my master's in cybersecurity strategy while stationed abroad, I told no one. What was the point? The last time I shared something like that, Dad replied, "That's nice. Nathan's working on a blockchain integration project right now, too. You two have so much in common." As if what I'd accomplished on active duty under constant threat while leading a multinational task force was somehow on par with a corporate buzzword and a whiteboard diagram. I used to think maybe Camille was the reason, that she had replaced me as the daughter in the house. She was charming, elegant, always ready with a joke or compliment. She fit. She knew how to navigate my parents' expectations like a diplomat. And Nathan? He basked in their pride like it was his birthright. He had their blueprint and followed it perfectly, business school, corporate ladder, family man. And me, I chose a different map. One with no guarantees, no holiday bonuses, no glossy Christmas cards. But I also chose purpose. And they never forgave me for it. One night during a brief visit home between deployments, I sat in the living room as Dad flipped through a presentation Nathan was preparing for an executive conference. "This is impressive," he said proudly. "You're leading real innovation here." Then he turned to me. "Still, working on computer stuff." Computer stuff. That was how he saw my job. I nodded, said nothing. What was the point? I went upstairs that night, packed my bag a day early, and left before breakfast. No one called to ask why. No one checked in. I think Mom sent me a picture of the leftover pie with the caption, "Too much dessert." As usual, I never replied. Sometimes the loudest rejection is silence. I didn't sleep much that night. The house was too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that echoes every thought you've buried, every word you never said. I lay awake in my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the slow creaks of settling wood and the distant hum of the heater kicking on. Downstairs, I could still hear Dad's deep voice in bursts muffled through the floorboards. Camille's light laughter. Nathan talking over people like he always did. It was a strange sort of torture being so close to them, but entirely removed. Present in body, forgotten in spirit. At some point, I sat up and opened the suitcase I had brought. My uniform lay folded at the bottom, encased in a protective garment bag. Midnight blue wool-polished buttons, ribbon bars lined with precise geometry. The silver eagle insignia, full colonel, glinted faintly in the low light of my desk lamp. I removed it carefully, smoothing the creases, inspecting for lint, checking each stitch. The rituals helped. Focus gave me calm. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't even about revenge. This was about presence. For years, I'd tried to be heard in this house through words. Now I'd speak through presence, through posture, through position. My nameplate was already printed for the meeting. Colonel Emma Carson, Department of Defense Liaison. It would sit at the head of a table surrounded by senior executives from Westbridge Technologies, including the two men who once told me explicitly and without hesitation that I had thrown my future away. They didn't know I'd be there tomorrow. Nathan had no idea that the very contract he bragged about at dinner was under my final review. He didn't know that I was the reason Lorraine Hart had flagged his Phase 2 proposal for re-evaluation. He didn't know that I had spent the past month combing through every technical document his team submitted and finding gaps. I wasn't going in to humiliate him. I wasn't going in for a show. But I was going in prepared. The next morning I woke before sunrise. Military habit. I ironed my shirt again, even though it was already crisp. I polished my shoes, tied my hair back, checked every detail twice. My medals were aligned, my ribbon rack flawless. I wore no perfume. My makeup was clean professional. I looked like every woman in uniform who had ever walked into a room full of men and refused to shrink. At exactly 07:45, I loaded my materials into a plain black case, zipped up my coat, and stepped outside. The morning air was sharp cold. It cleared the last traces of sleep from my head. As I backed out of the driveway, I glanced up at the window of my old room. It felt like closing the door on a chapter no longer out of bitterness, but out of clarity. By 08:10, I was at the front gates of Westbridge Technologies, the same building where my father had spent 30 years, where Nathan had become the golden boy, where I had been nothing more than an afterthought if I was thought of at all. Today, that would change. The security officer at the front checkpoint scanned my credentials without question. "Good morning, Colonel Carson," he said with practiced respect. I nodded. "Morning." Inside the lobby was sleek and sterile marble floors, digital displays, a massive wall-sized LED board looping promotional content. I waited for the elevator in silence. No nerves. Just stillness. This wasn't war. But it was a battlefield all the same. When the doors slid open on the executive floor, I adjusted. My caller stepped out and made my way to the boardroom. At exactly 08:58, I pulled open the glass door, walked into the room, and took my seat. Today, I would not be overlooked. I've sat through war games, strategic briefings, even last-minute security crises with foreign governments breathing down our network's neck, but nothing has ever felt quite like the tension that settled over that dinner table. The night before everything changed, I sat at my family's dining table, back straight, hands folded neatly in my lap, like a guest who didn't belong but didn't dare offend the hosts. Nathan was mid-story again about a new initiative he was leading for Westbridge Technologies, something about optimizing system architecture and aligning timelines for Department of Defense compliance. His voice had that same effortless rhythm he always used when he knew no one would interrupt him. He smiled like someone who had already won, who had no idea there was another player in the game. Dad nodded along, sipping his second glass of wine. "That kind of foresight, that's what separates leaders from managers," he said with pride. "You're ready for more, Nathan. They'd be smart to move you into executive strategy." Nathan basked in it. He always did. "And it's defense work," Camille added. "Which is exciting, right?" She looked at me then, eyes bright like she was offering a peace branch. I smiled politely. "It's important work." My fork moved slowly across my plate, mostly untouched. My stomach had no interest in food. "Well, speaking of military," my mom interjected, turning to me with a look that hovered between performative interest and genuine confusion. "Emma, are you still traveling?" "Where did you say you were stationed last?" "I didn't," I said evenly. She blinked. "Oh, well, are you still—" "What is it, Captain?" Dad glanced over, expression unreadable. You've been in quite a while now, haven't you? Thought they'd move you up by now. I've moved, I said. The silence that followed was short but suffocating. I didn't fill it. I let it rest there like a fog, just long enough to make everyone mildly uncomfortable. Nathan broke it, of course. Must be tough, though. No real long-term track, right? Just following orders, rotating through bases. You don't get to build anything permanent. I looked at him across the table, studied the way he held his wine glass, the way he already seemed to expect me to agree. That was his real talent, assuming the world confirmed his perspective. I do a bit more than just follow orders, I said quietly. Nathan shrugged, smiling. Didn't mean it that way. But he did. They all did. To them, my life had been one long detour, a career defined not by achievement, but by the absence of their approval. I wasn't the daughter who became something. I was the daughter who left. They hadn't even asked why I joined. No one ever had. Not back then, not now. It was easier for them to assume it was rebellion or stubbornness or Dad's favorite immaturity. The truth, I joined because I believed in something bigger than myself, because I wanted to lead, not inherit, because I didn't want to spend my life in the shadow of my father's expectations or my brother's trajectory. But I didn't say any of that. Not at that table. Not the night before the world reset itself. Instead, I finished my glass of water and stood. I'm going to head up, I said. Mom frowned. You didn't eat. I'm not hungry. You sure everything's okay? Camille asked softly. I paused at the foot of the stairs, looked back at all of them, their faces lit by chandelier light and years of the same hierarchy. Everything's fine, I said, because it was. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to be understood. I didn't want them to ask. I didn't care if they did, because tomorrow I wouldn't need their validation. I'd have a room full of people who already knew who I was. As I climbed the stairs, I heard Nathan's voice drift up behind me. She's always been a little intense about things. Laughter followed. They still didn't get it, but they would. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't scream. It doesn't demand attention or bleed out in dramatic scenes. It just sinks in quiet, precise, like a needle finding a nerve. That was the kind of pain I felt that night. I lay on my old bed, fully dressed, staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling, the soft hum of conversation downstairs, drifting upward like background noise in a dream I didn't want to revisit. It was strange being back in this room like I'd stepped into a preserved museum exhibit of who I used to be. Honor roll certificates still framed in cheap plastic, ROTC medals pinned to a faded corkboard. A photo of me at 17, holding my acceptance letter to business school, smiling wide and naive long before I dared to change the plan. Everything in this room froze the moment I enlisted. Nothing new had been added since. I got up and walked over to the dresser, pulling open the top drawer. Inside were a few scattered things I'd left behind, an old digital watch, a dried-up stick of lip balm, a folded letter I recognized instantly. It was the handwritten note I'd left for my parents the night before I flew to basic training. They never responded to it. I unfolded the paper. The creases were still sharp. I know this isn't what you wanted, but I need to do this for me. I hope someday you'll understand why. I love you. Emma. I read it twice, then slipped it back into the drawer. I didn't need to read their answer anymore. They'd been living it for the last decade. Downstairs, laughter broke out. Camille, probably. She had the kind of social grace that made her fit in anywhere, especially with my parents. She'd slid seamlessly into the role of second daughter, one who never made waves, never asked uncomfortable questions, never broke expectations. She didn't even have to try. She was exactly what my mother had always imagined I would be: composed, agreeable, pretty, in a way that played well in country club brunches. And Nathan, he had never questioned how easily he'd stepped into the spotlight I used to reach for. He just assumed it had always been his. I remembered one night years ago, right after I'd gotten my first assignment with Cyber Command. I'd called home genuinely excited. I'd just finished working on a high-priority vulnerability scan for a government defense system real sensitive infrastructure. When Dad picked up, I told him the broad strokes. I wasn't allowed to share details, of course, but I thought he'd at least be curious. Instead, he said, "That's great, honey. Nathan's giving a TEDx talk next month on innovation in defense tech. You should watch it. He's really coming into his own." That was the moment I stopped trying to impress them. But tonight, with their voices echoing below and that same feeling crawling back into my chest, I felt the sting of every casual cut they'd delivered over the years. The digs were never cruel, just constant. Military's fine, I guess, for people who don't want the stress of real corporate work. You've always been more independent. Not a team player, but that's not necessarily bad. You're lucky you don't have a family to worry about. Makes those relocations easier. None of it was said to hurt me. That's what made it worse. It was just how they thought. That my life, my rank, my accomplishments, my sacrifice was secondary to Nathan's stable, linear, boardroom-bound path. They never meant to cut me down. They just never thought to build me up. At 11:04 p.m., I heard the last of the kitchen lights click off. Footsteps passed the base of the stairs. A door creaked shut. Silence settled over the house again, like dust returning to untouched furniture. I sat back on the edge of my bed, staring at the closed suitcase in the corner. Inside it, my uniform waited, pressed, precise, ready. I wouldn't be explaining myself tomorrow. I wouldn't need to. They'd see it all on my shoulders, in my title, in the way the room responded to my presence. And maybe, just maybe in the silence that followed, they'd finally realize what it meant to overlook someone who had never needed their permission to rise. I've spent years learning how to compartmentalize. In the Army, it's a survival skill. You build boxes in your head and learn to live inside them. Pain goes in one, doubt in another. You sort shelve and move forward. You don't let it spill into your posture, your voice, or your work. You can't afford to. Tonight, though, those compartments were full. I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor of my old room, the suitcase open in front of me, uniform laid out with military precision. My back rested against the side of the bed, the patchwork quilt pressing into my shoulder blades. It smelled faintly of detergent and old summers. The air was thick with memory. This wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't even sadness. It was the quiet realization that I no longer belonged here, and maybe I never really had. All around me were relics of the version of Emma my family approved of. The Emma who followed directions, smiled for pictures, earned straight A's, applied to all the right programs. The Emma who wanted to be useful without being seen too much, smart without being intimidating, obedient without question. That Emma was long gone, but this room hadn't noticed. I reached under the bed and pulled out an old shoebox I hadn't touched in over a decade. Inside were fragments of a girl trying to be enough letters from teachers' recommendation forms, SAT scores, a crumpled acceptance letter to Wharton. I had held on to it longer than I care to admit. Not because I regretted turning it down, but because I once believed it was my golden ticket into being seen by my father. Funny how that didn't work out. I stared at the letter for a long moment, then folded it back up and returned it to the box. I didn't need it anymore. That chapter had closed the moment I laced my boots and boarded a military bus instead of sitting through orientation with a fresh MBA cohort. And I'd never looked back. What I did instead was earn my place the hard way. I trained. I deployed. I learned systems strategy, leadership, and loss. I briefed generals. I led men and women twice my age. I signed classified memos with my own name, stamped with authority most civilians would never understand. I was promoted early. I was chosen to represent Cyber Command at global strategy summits. I became someone I was proud of, someone real. But none of that existed in this house. To them, I was still the one who walked away. And the part that always hit the hardest was knowing they didn't even care why. My choices were simply inconvenient to their narrative. Nathan's journey was the one they'd pinned their hopes to. Camille fit so perfectly into the image of a polished family unit that I sometimes wondered if my mother had dreamed her into being. I meanwhile became the ghost in the room, mentioned sparingly, described in vague terms, never quite understood, never quite embraced. It wasn't anger that settled over me now. It wasn't bitterness either. It was release. I wasn't here to be accepted. I wasn't here for apologies or backdated affection. I had long since stopped needing those things. I had fought too many battles on foreign soil, in secure networks, and in conference rooms full of skeptical superiors to still crave recognition from people who refused to ask a single question about what my days actually looked like. The Emma they ignored had grown into someone powerful, and tomorrow they would meet her not in the kitchen or at the dinner table, but in a boardroom in uniform with a title they didn't even know I held. That thought steadied me. I stood carefully, lifted my uniform onto the hanger, and moved toward the closet. As I slid the door open, I caught my reflection in the long, dusty mirror attached inside. For a second, I didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her jaw was sharper, her eyes steadier, her back straighter. That was me. Not the child who grew up here, not the one who begged for permission to be herself. The woman in the mirror didn't need permission. And tomorrow morning she would walk into Westbridge Technologies not as the afterthought daughter, not as the shadow of Nathan Carson, but as Colonel Emma Carson, United States Army Cyber Command Pentagon liaison. And she would take up space. Finally. I woke up before the sun. Old habits. I didn't need an alarm, my body knew the rhythm. Years of 0500 wake-ups had programmed me to rise with purpose, with stillness. But this morning wasn't about formations or briefings or inspections. This morning was about confrontation. Not the loud kind with shouting or slammed doors. The kind that happened with silence, with a title printed on a placard, with people standing when you walk into a room because they finally understand your rank. I moved through my morning like I was back in a deployment prep tent. Precise, deliberate. Every movement rooted in ritual, shower, hair pinned back tight, military standard, no curls, no distractions, makeup minimal, no fragrance, nothing that could suggest I came to impress. I wasn't here to decorate their space. I came to define mine. I unzipped the garment bag and pulled out the uniform. Midnight blue, 4 silver buttons, ribbons set perfectly in 3 rows, badge polished the night before. The silver eagle insignia gleamed at the shoulder kernel. I ran my fingers over it as if touching it made it more real, even though I'd worn it for months. But here in this house, it still felt like armor, because here my rank wasn't recognized. Here I was still the one who left the daughter who traded pencil skirts for fatigues, corner office dreams, for classified deployments. As I dressed, I thought about all the rooms I'd stood in, situation rooms, bunkers, intel halls, operations, centers, rooms where decisions carried weight, where people listened when I spoke because lives depended on the accuracy of my words. And yet I couldn't get a seat at my own family's table without being reminded that I moved too much or that I was intense. The jacket snapped into place. I pulled the belt taut, straightened my shoulders, and stared at myself in the mirror. Colonel Emma Carson, 30 years old, United States Army Cyber Command, liaison to the Department of Defense. I looked composed, even calm, but beneath that surface was steel. I checked the time, 06:42. Right on schedule. I had an hour and a half before the meeting, just enough to drive across town, clear security, and walk in without rush. I packed my materials into a plain black case, just a tablet, a briefing binder, and a copy of the latest systems evaluation report. I double-checked the presentation notes I'd prepared for the executive board. I already knew them by heart, but going through them again steadied my hands. Downstairs, the house was quiet. No footsteps, no voices, no one to stop me, no one to ask where I was going or why I looked different. And that was fine. I didn't want them to see me like this in the hallway or at the breakfast table. They would see me in the boardroom under bright lights, flanked by executives introduced by the CEO, given the floor not because I was their daughter or sister, but because I had earned it. Outside, the morning was crisp, the air cold enough to sting. I breathed it in slowly, letting the sharpness wake up every nerve. The driveway looked smaller than it had when I was a teenager, when I used to stand right here, wondering what it would feel like to leave. Now I knew. Leaving wasn't the hard part. Returning with nothing to prove, that was the real test. The SUV was already packed. I opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and paused. Hands on the wheel, heart steady, no hesitation. This was no longer about family politics. This was about walking into a space that once dismissed me and owning it completely. At 07:10, I backed out of the driveway and didn't look at the house in the rearview mirror. Some places stop being home long before you leave them, but some uniforms, they become your home, your protection, your truth. And mine would walk into Westbridge Technologies today, not seeking validation, not chasing respect, but commanding it. I arrived at Westbridge Technologies 15 minutes early, just the way I was trained. The parking lot was already half full. Black sedans and glossy hybrids lined the front spaces, most with corporate decals or defense contractor tags. I bypassed them and pulled into the space labeled DoD Liaison, Reserved. I could practically feel the invisible question marks from passing employees who didn't yet know who I was or what I represented. I cut the engine, sat for a moment, and watched the morning unfold around me. Employees filtered in through the main entrance, ID badges clipped to coats, phones in hand, mid-conversation, all moving with the urgency of people who thought they understood the stakes. I stepped out slowly. The cold air hit instantly, but I welcomed it. It kept my focus sharp. The metal of my insignia felt cool against my collarbone as I adjusted it. I smoothed the edges of my jacket, shut the car door behind me, and walked toward the front entrance like I belonged there, because I did. As I approached security, the guard glanced up, did a quick double-take, then stood straighter. "Good morning, Colonel," he said, scanning my badge with careful precision. His voice held the kind of professional respect that always makes civilians just a little nervous. "Morning." I nodded, calm and even. Inside the lobby was exactly as I remembered from years ago, a study in muted luxury. Marble floors, polished chrome, LED display boards looping through promotional videos, investor highlights, and footage from defense innovation conferences. A digital banner overhead read, "Westbridge powering the future of security." The irony didn't escape me. I rode the elevator to the executive floor alone. As the numbers climbed, I checked my reflection in the brushed metal doors. Straight shoulders, focused eyes, no hesitation. When the doors opened, I stepped out into a long hallway of smoked glass offices and designer carpet. I knew the layout by memory now, thanks to weeks of prep floor plans and briefing docs. I knew where everyone sat. I knew the boardroom was at the far end of the hall, and I knew that my seat, the one they didn't expect, was already set. Then I saw him. Nathan. He stood by the tall window halfway down the corridor, flipping through a sleek presentation tablet. His blazer was sharp-tailored, and his confidence was effortless. He hadn't seen me yet. When he did, it was like watching someone realize they'd misread the entire script. He blinked. "Emma." His voice was half confused, half cautious. "What? Are you wearing—" I didn't stop walking. "Morning," I said simply, my tone clipped but neutral. "Mr. Carson?" He looked stunned. "Wait, what's going on? Why are you here for the project review?" I said as I passed him without pause. Behind me, I heard the sharp click of heels. A voice called out from the far end of the hallway, confident, composed. "Colonel Carson," Lorraine Hart said, striding forward. "I didn't realize you'd be attending in person today." "Thought I'd make myself available for the session," I replied, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm. Her eyes flicked to Nathan, then back to me. And then she smiled. "You'll elevate the room just by being here." She turned to the group now gathering near the boardroom entrance, mid-level execs, engineers, team leads, all hovering with notepads and nervous energy. For those unaware, she announced, "This is Colonel Emma Carson, our Pentagon liaison for Project Sentinel. She has final authority on all strategic and cybersecurity protocols tied to this contract." The air shifted. It always does when a room realizes they've been making assumptions about the wrong person. I didn't look at Nathan. I didn't have to. The silence told me everything. Lorraine gestured toward the boardroom. "Shall we?" I nodded once and stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the room where everything was about to change, not just for the company or for the contract, but for the family who never saw me coming. The moment I stepped into the boardroom, everything slowed. Not literally, of course, but perception has a way of bending when expectation and reality collide. The room was sleek and intimidating in that calculated modern way, long glass walls recessed, lighting a giant oak table with chrome legs. At least a dozen executives were already seated, flipping through printed agendas and adjusting their lanyards. A few glanced up when I entered, then quickly did a double-take. One stood. Another straightened their posture instinctively, and then the ripple began. Every eye turned to me. Not with confusion, at least not the kind laced with disrespect, but with recognition. Even the ones who didn't know who I was could tell immediately someone important had arrived. Lorraine Hart walked beside me like we'd done this 100 times. "Colonel Carson," she said with a calm nod of respect. "Welcome. Your seat is at the head next to mine." I walked the full length of the room in full uniform, my boots making a crisp sound on the polished floor, past open mouths and stilled fingers. And when I reached my seat, I paused for just a moment, enough time to let it sink in. Then I sat. My nameplate was already there. Colonel Emma Carson, DoD Liaison Cyber Command. The man sitting 3 chairs down blinked hard and began to fumble through the printed materials. Another executive across the table shot a wide-eyed glance at his colleague. It was like watching a boardroom slowly recalibrate their hierarchy in real time. Nathan and my father entered last. I heard their voices before I saw their faces murmuring upbeat, unaware. And then they saw me. Nathan stopped walking mid-stride. His mouth opened slightly like a man trying to solve a riddle without the clues. He looked down at my nameplate, then back up at me. "Emma," he asked too loudly. My father came up behind him, still catching up until his gaze followed Nathan's and landed on me. He froze. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Lorraine didn't miss a beat. "Gentlemen, please take your seats. We're about to begin." They moved mechanically like people thrown into a play they hadn't rehearsed. Nathan took a seat halfway down the table. Dad chose the chair next to him. Neither spoke. Neither made eye contact. The meeting began promptly at 0900. Lorraine opened with a few comments about innovation and collaboration. Then she turned to me. "We're especially fortunate to have Colonel Carson with us today," she said. "Her guidance has been crucial in aligning our cyber strategy with Pentagon compliance standards. She'll be reviewing the key deliverables and expectations for Phase 2. I stood. The room went still. "Thank you, Ms. Hart," I said, projecting calm and control. "Before we dive in, I want to reiterate the Department of Defense's focus on integration integrity. We've reviewed Westbridge's existing architecture, and while there's progress, there are areas that remain critically behind timeline. My goal is to ensure this project meets every strategic threshold, no exceptions." I began my briefing, slides on the screen, bullet points crisp, every word sharp, technical, precise. Not a single person interrupted me, not even my father. Not even Nathan. And when I finished the first round of analysis and turned toward the team, I felt the shift settle into the walls. They weren't just listening anymore, they were following. I was no longer the daughter who had gone her own way. I was the one holding the authority in the room. The girl they dismissed had become the gatekeeper to their success, and no one knew how to look me in the eye. When I wrapped up my section of the briefing, I sat down without a word, my back straight, my hands calm. I didn't need applause. I wasn't here for validation. I was here to set the tone. Lorraine smiled slightly. "Thank you, Colonel. That was crystal clear. Let's proceed with the Phase 2 rollout proposal. Nathan, go ahead." I turned my head slowly, almost theatrically, to face him. Nathan cleared his throat as he stood. He wasn't ready. I could see it in his shoulders, the sudden stiffness in his jaw. This wasn't the audience he'd practiced for. This wasn't the safe conference room where he performed for Dad and a handful of middle managers. This was my field now. As systems integration lead, Nathan began glancing nervously at the tablet in his hands. "I've outlined a revised schedule for the Sentinel implementation. Our team believes the updated delivery timeline better reflects hardware availability and contractor bandwidth. Additionally, we're, enhancing the data stream protocols to align with expected throughput." His voice faltered just slightly on throughput. I waited. He continued, but the room was already shifting. He wasn't making eye contact. His bullet points lacked focus. He didn't sound confident. He sounded like a man suddenly unsure of his own footing. When he finished, he looked directly at Lorraine, avoiding me completely. "Thank you," she said with a polite nod. Then she turned to me. "Colonel, your thoughts?" I didn't rush my reply. I let the silence breathe. "Nathan." I began, calm and deliberate. Your presentation references throughput enhancements. Could you clarify how those changes account for the latency threshold specified in the February 3rd Pentagon directive? He blinked. I wasn't aware there were updated thresholds beyond the January memo. There were, I said flatly. Updated benchmarks were published 5 weeks ago. They're not optional. Oh, I must have missed that. He gave a quick laugh like he was trying to soften the moment. I can revisit that section. You'll need to, I replied, my voice level. Our systems demand real-time validation at 200 millims or lower under peak strain. Your current structure is exceeding 270 in simulation. The room was dead quiet. Lorraine raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Nathan tried to recover. Right. Okay. I'll have our team review those specs and make necessary adjustments by next week. No, I said. I want the revised protocol draft submitted by close of business Thursday. He blinked again. That's, tight. This project is under audit. Your timeline just became non-negotiable. For a second, his face was a perfect mix of disbelief and discomfort. Then he nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. Ma'am. I'd heard it from dozens of officers, contractors, diplomats, but hearing it from Nathan, that landed differently. The dynamic had officially shifted. He was no longer my older brother trying to hold court at the dinner table. He was a subordinate trying to survive a meeting he didn't control. And Dad? He hadn't said a word. I glanced his way. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight, his fingers clasped together on the table like he was trying not to react. Good. Let him process. Let him sit in the reality that the daughter he once called aimless was now his superior's superior. The rest of the meeting moved forward with precision. Engineers presented specs. I asked follow-ups. Directors answered with an edge of formality that hadn't existed an hour ago. By the time we adjourned, the hierarchy of the room had been fully rewritten. People lingered afterward to thank me. A few handed me updated reports. Someone offered to walk me to my reserved office space. Nathan stayed quiet. Dad stood stiffly beside him, eyes distant. And I packed up my case slowly, every motion deliberate. This wasn't revenge. This was visibility. And for the first time in my life, they saw me. They waited for me just outside the boardroom. Through the glass walls, I could see them before I stepped out, my father standing stiffly with his hands on his hips, Nathan beside him with his arms crossed and his jaw set like concrete, the same way he used to stand when we were kids and he got caught breaking something but wouldn't admit it. My pulse didn't spike. If anything, it slowed. When I pushed open the door, the conversation in the hallway dulled. Lorraine had already disappeared down the corridor, trailed by 2 directors. The rest of the staff passed by quietly, eyes respectfully lowered or averted. Not out of fear, just recognition. Emma Dad said, stepping forward first. I didn't answer. He gestured toward the nearby executive lounge. Can we talk in private? I looked at him, then at Nathan, and gave a single nod. Lead the way. Inside the lounge was empty. Just leather chairs, a long window, and a coffee station no one ever used. I took a position near the far wall and didn't sit. Neither did they. Nathan finally broke the silence. You've been a colonel for how long? 6 months, I replied. He blinked. 6 months. He repeated it like he didn't believe me. I sent invitations to my promotion ceremony. I emailed the press release. I left voicemails. None of you responded. Dad's eyes narrowed slightly. You never explained what it meant. I tilted my head. Colonel isn't a complicated word. I mean, we didn't realize it was that significant, he replied, as if that excused anything. My voice remained calm. You didn't ask. Moments like this used to gut me. The silence, the blank stares, the passive erasure of everything I'd worked for. But now it just confirmed what I already knew. You could have told us what you were really doing, Nathan said, quieter now. I did. Multiple times. You just didn't listen because it didn't fit your version of who I was supposed to be. They didn't respond. So I went on. Every call was about quarterly numbers, about Nathan's next talk, about Camille's LinkedIn update. Not once did either of you ask where I was stationed, what my job actually was, if I was okay. Dad exhaled sharply, pacing a few steps toward the window. "I thought you were stuck," Nathan muttered, bouncing from base to base, never settling, just following orders. I met his gaze head-on. "You said that at dinner. You laughed while saying it." He dropped his eyes. "I didn't know," he said. "You never tried to," I replied. There was a beat of silence. Long, uncomfortable. Then Dad turned to face me again. "So what do you want now?" Public acknowledgement. An apology. A shout-out in the company newsletter. I shook my head. "I want nothing but what I've always deserved: respect. For my work, for my choices, for the fact that I didn't fail just because I didn't follow your blueprint." He didn't respond, but something in his expression shifted. Not quite softness, not quite regret, just awareness, like a man realizing the foundation he built his certainty on might have had cracks he chose not to see. Nathan took a step forward. "You were fair," he said, voice lower now, "in that meeting. You could have embarrassed me, and you didn't. I wasn't there to humiliate you," I said. "I was doing my job." He nodded slowly. "You were commanding." That word lingered. It wasn't the compliment I'd craved all those years, but it was honest, earned. Dad looked at me again, really looked this time. "You've built something I don't fully understand," he admitted. "That's on me." He extended his hand, not stiffly, not performative. It was a real gesture, a quiet offering of respect. I looked at it, then I took it. Firm grip. No bitterness, just closure. "I accept." We didn't hug. There was no tearful reunion, no dramatic music swelling behind some heartfelt group embrace. This wasn't a movie. This was real life, and real life doesn't wrap conflict up in a bow. But there was a pause, a moment where things didn't feel as sharp. Nathan stepped back first, rubbing the back of his neck like he used to when he was caught off guard. "So, what happens now?" I looked between him and my father. "That depends," I said. "If this is just a moment, just temporary guilt or discomfort, then nothing happens. We go back to how it was. You pretend today was a one-off. And if it's not Dad asked." I shrugged. "Then maybe it's a beginning." He nodded slowly, not defensive, just listening now. We stood in that lounge for another few seconds, the silence more comfortable than it had any right to be. Then my father cleared his throat. "Your mother's going to want to talk." "I figured," I said. She's been confused for a long time, Emma. But she's not heartless. She just didn't know what she was missing." "I did," I replied quietly. "We didn't say goodbye. No one made promises. But when I left that room, my father didn't look at me like a stranger anymore, and Nathan didn't look at me like an inconvenience. They looked at me like someone they finally understood, or were beginning to." 6 months later, my apartment in Washington, D.C. was clean quiet and full of subtle reminders of everything I'd built. Framed citations, diplomas, photos of missions I couldn't talk about but would never forget. A wall-mounted shadow box of medals, including the silver eagle pins from the day I made full colonel. I didn't display them for guests. I displayed them for myself. Not to prove anything, but to remember. That night my family came over for dinner. Yes, really. My father was the first to arrive, awkwardly holding a framed magazine article. "Figured you might want a copy," he said, handing it to me. It was a full-page feature from Defense Insight Weekly covering Project Sentinel's successful launch. There was a picture of me in uniform standing beside Lorraine Hart and General Armstrong. The headline read, "Leading the Future, Colonel Carson and the Cyber Frontier." "I've had this hanging in my office," Dad added. "Didn't tell anyone you were my daughter, at first." I smiled. "As long as it's working." "It is," he said. Then, after a pause, added, "So are you." It wasn't everything, but it was something. And this time I knew I didn't need anyone's approval to feel whole. But having it, that was a start. There was something strange, almost surreal about seeing my father laugh in my living room. Not politely, not performatively, but genuinely. He sat near the window, the same spot he had quietly stood in 6 months ago when he first examined the medals on my bookshelf and realized the daughter he thought he'd lost had grown into someone he never imagined. Now he was leaning back telling Camille a story about a project from his early days at Westbridge, one I'd heard a dozen times growing up, but this time he made space for others to speak too. That was new. My mother moved through the kitchen like she belonged there, even though I had to show her where I kept the pie server. Still apple, she'd reminded me as she slid slices onto plates. But I tried a new crust. Thought you deserved an upgrade. Her words stuck with me. Not because of the recipe, but because of the effort. My family hadn't magically transformed, but they were trying, in ways that once felt impossible. After dinner, we settled in for coffee, and the conversation drifted to Project Sentinel's recent Phase 2 milestone. Nathan listened quietly as I explained some of the encryption modifications we'd implemented, no longer interrupting, no longer pretending to know more than he did. Instead, he asked, "You think we could use that framework for the Homeland Security prototype?" I nodded. "If you streamline the packet layer and address the memory bottleneck, definitely." He smiled. "We're already seeing latency drop thanks to that revision you pushed. You mean the one you fought me on last quarter?" He laughed. "Touché. There was no edge to it, no competition, just collaboration. Respect. That was new too." My father had asked if he could bring a copy of the article to his next leadership meeting, not as proof of redemption, but as something he was proud of. He'd looked me in the eye and said, "You've built something we don't understand, but it's real, and it matters." My mother, in her own way, had started asking better questions, not surface-level ones, real ones, about the missions I could talk about where I felt most challenged, about what made me stay in. I told her the truth. I stayed because I became someone I respected. It was the most honest thing I'd ever said in front of her. She didn't cry. She just nodded, her eyes a little glassy, and said, "I'm glad we finally got to meet that version of you." Nathan, meanwhile, had started forwarding articles to me. Not the self-congratulatory kind, the kind that asked tough questions about strategy and defense tech. "I thought of you," he'd say. "What's your take?" As if my insight wasn't just valuable but essential. We weren't perfect, not yet, maybe not ever. But we were no longer strangers playing roles written years ago. We were rewriting the script scene by scene. A few weeks later, I got a call from Lorraine Hart. "Emma," she said, "the Pentagon's recommending you for lead liaison on the new NATO fusion protocol. You'd be coordinating across 5 countries. It's massive." "You interested?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I wasn't ready, but because I realized something. I didn't have to say yes to prove anything. I didn't need to climb higher to validate who I'd already become. "I'm interested," I finally said, "but only if I get to shape the team from scratch." "You've earned that," Lorraine replied, and just like that, the future opened up, not because I was chasing it, but because I had become it. There's something liberating about no longer having to explain yourself. I used to spend years trying to prove I belonged at the dinner table, in the boardroom, in the uniform. Always walking a step faster, working twice as hard, never asking for help, just so no one would have an excuse to question me. Now, I didn't need to rush. I didn't need to speak louder. I just had to show up. And people listened. Not because I demanded it, but because I had earned it. That shift was subtle at first, emails worded differently, meetings opening with my questions instead of someone else's. But over time it became structural. I wasn't just a voice in the room, I was helping build the room itself. After accepting the NATO Fusion Protocol assignment, I was granted authority to build my own team. I didn't go for the obvious names. I didn't bring in people who were loudest or most decorated. I chose those who had been overlooked, underestimated, the ones who had quietly kept systems alive behind the scenes. The first person I recruited was Major Ayanna Cole. Ayanna was a cyber ops genius who'd been passed over for promotion 3 times because she wasn't a good culture fit code for being blunt brilliant and not good at office politics. When I called her, she paused for a long time before speaking. "Colonel Carson, are you sure?" I smiled into the phone. "Yes, and I don't want the version of you that makes other people comfortable. I want the one who scares lazy leadership." She laughed, then said, "I'm in." One by one, I built the kind of team I wish I'd had a decade ago, a team where no one had to shrink to fit in, where ideas weren't filtered through ego, where someone could admit they didn't know something and not be dismissed for it. We got to work fast. Weekly meetings turned into daily strategy sessions. We were coordinating with 5 countries, 6 time zones, and more acronyms than should be legally allowed. But we made progress. Real progress. Not because we were perfect, but because we trusted each other, and because I let them lead. That's something no one ever taught me to do, not at home, not in my early days in uniform. Leadership had always been modeled as control, hierarchy, order. But I'd learned something else: the best leaders create conditions where others thrive, and in doing so they become undeniable. One afternoon, Ayanna and I were reviewing the multi-layer encryption draft in the conference lounge when she glanced over and asked, "Did you ever think you'd end up here?" I considered the question. "Not in the beginning," I said. "Back then, I just wanted to prove them wrong." She nodded. "Same. But that doesn't last," I added. "Eventually, proving people wrong stops being fuel. It burns out. You have to find something better, something for yourself." "What was it for you?" she asked. "Becoming someone I respect?" I said. "Someone I would have needed when I was 22 and drowning in doubt." Ayanna smiled at that. "You know, my little sister applied to OTS last week, first in our family." I raised my brows. "That's huge." She told me it's because she saw what I built, and because she read that article about you. That hit me harder than any medal. There's a certain moment, quiet but powerful, when you realize the fight wasn't just for yourself. That all the resistance, all the rejection, every slammed door wasn't just a detour, it was the path. And now others are walking it too. A month later, I was invited to speak at a cybersecurity summit in Boston, not as a guest, as the keynote. I opened with a story, not about war rooms or encrypted assets, but about being 21 alone in my barracks listening to a voicemail from home that said, "Maybe it's not too late to quit and come back." I told the audience what I didn't do that day. I didn't quit. I didn't go home. Instead, I built a new one. And now, I said, looking across a sea of uniforms and suits, I spend less time explaining why I deserve to be in the room and more time making sure others don't have to. The applause was quiet at first. Then it swelled. Not because it was a performance, but because it was truth. I wasn't here just to lead, I was here to make space. We weren't just occupying space now, we were defining it.